Okay.
Hi, Rosalind.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for giving up your lunch hour if you're on the West Coast, or an hour of your afternoon if you are somewhere else located in Canada or elsewhere. And welcome to the official launch of our report out of the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions, Municipal Matters, Building Capacity for Local Climate Conversations. I'm Heidi Tworek. I'm a professor of history and public policy, and I'm director of the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions. Our centre seeks to understand the past, analyse the present, and train for the future. We focus on how media, information, and communications affect democracy. Now, climate change is certainly one of the most important issues facing democracy today. So we are delighted to have you join us for the release of our report. We're very grateful to deliver this presentation today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Now, all of you virtually are joining us from many different Indigenous lands and territories, each with their own deep and enduring relationship to the land. And for us, a land acknowledgement, I think, is particularly meaningful when we talk about climate action, because Indigenous knowledge systems are centered around strong connections between people, land, and community. So what we're going to do today with the 58 minutes that you're going to spend with us is first present the major findings of our report. Then I'm going to moderate a conversation with our two distinguished guests, Amber Bennett and Ros Donald, while also interweaving questions from you, the audience. So please do use your opportunity to ask questions, both of our guests and of us, the authors of the report. Now, just some logistics before we get going. This is being recorded, as you heard from the metallic voice at the beginning of this webinar, and we'll also be noting the Q&A. If you wish, you can use the transcript option at the bottom of Zoom to see a transcript of this conversation. Now, we really do invite you to ask questions at any moment that they occur to me, and you can type your questions in the Q&A window, again, that you find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So you won't be required to use your camera or microphone to ask questions. I will be monitoring the Q&A, and I will relay questions to the speakers, and I'll just use your first name only. Now, the report that we are launching today, Municipal Matters, Building Capacity for Local Climate Conversation, was a big team effort for CSDI. And the report was co-written by 6 people: Divijan Madani, Ghassan Hamzeh, Madeline Sides, Nicolas Cotier, Christopher Tenove, and myself. So we couldn't all 6 of us present. So today we're handing over to 2 very capable key members of our team, Ghassan Hamzeh and Maddie Sides, who will present the key findings of our report. Ghassan is a researcher and public policy student who specializes in climate change policy and solutions, has a background in economics, and previously worked in land rights for Indigenous communities. Maddie is a researcher and public policy student who specializes in issues ranging from climate change to the spread of misinformation. And she has a background in climate justice, organizing, and education at UBC. So following the presentation from Maddie and Ghassan, we will hear comments on these issues more broadly and on the report from our 2 special guests. And I'll introduce them briefly now. Dr. Rosalind Donald is an assistant professor of climate, environmental justice, media and communication at American University. She researches how climate change communication can be made more just and effective by examining the links between histories of environmental injustice and the current climate debate. And before she received her PhD from Columbia University, she was deputy editor of Carbon Brief, a climate science and policy website where she specialized in climate communication and disinformation. And our second distinguished guest is Amber Bennett, who is the executive director of Re.Climate, a non-partisan public institution housed at Carleton University's Sustainable Energy Research Centre. Amber is one of Canada's top climate communication strategists and capacity builders who works with groups across the country, bridging the gap between research and practice. And finally, before we launch into the presentation of our report, we want to acknowledge that this project is partially funded by the Canadian government's Digital Citizen Contribution Programme, as well as UBC's Centre for Computational Social Science. We've also worked with a very broad range of partners who we've pictured on this slide in the interest of time. So thank you to all of those partners for their deep engagement with our work. And now I'm delighted to hand over to Maddie and Ghassan to present our report.
Thank you, Heidi. And for all of you who messaged us saying there's some feedback, we heard that. We'll get working on it. Thank you. And I'll start by explaining that as for the question of why focus on local climate misinformation, there are a few reasons. First, local governments play a pivotal role in addressing climate change. When local governments commit to climate action, a key element of success is engaged, informed, and inclusive public conversation. And unfortunately, thanks to political, social, and informational tensions, local governments that pursue climate action increasingly face misleading, false, or hostile claims, aka misinformation. And while misinformation at national and international levels have received significant attention from researchers and policymakers, the extent and impact of the issue on the local level remains underexplored. Local governments can experience misinformation about lots of things, from claims that local government officials are part of a nationwide plot to claims that local climate policies are, well, also part of a nationwide plot. That variety begs the question then of what are the best responses to misinformation at the local level? And what characterizes misinformation at the local level? How is it distinct? So understanding that, this project is born out of a need to understand how the information crisis is impacting local government climate policy. A key issue is that local governments are increasingly at the forefront of climate action, making them vulnerable to misinformation and disinformation that undermines public trust and hampers progress. We've conducted research to examine how misinformation spreads at the local government level and what can be done to combat it. We spoke with experts from local governments, experts focusing on local governments and on misinformation, and we read through more bizarre tweets than we would care to admit. To give you all an example of misinformation impacting a local government, I'll quickly talk about one of the case studies that's included in our report. This is Edmonton, Alberta, home to some beautiful nature, also home to the 2024 Stanley Cup Finals runners-up, and home to a 2021 initiative by the city to incorporate the 15-minute city concept into its district planning. 15-minute cities plans aim to create vibrant neighborhoods where key services are within 15 minutes by walking, biking, or transit. And unfortunately for Edmonton, the plan faced organized demonstrations and heated city council meetings with accusations of climate tyranny. To understand what was happening online in 2024 with Edmonton's 15-minute city plan, we analyzed around 500 posts on 15-minute cities. Along with some reasonable concerns about issues like potential gentrification, we identified a set of conspiratorial narratives that linked 15-minute cities to climate lockdowns and a great reset promoted by globalist forces and other things like that. These claims contained misinformation about the actual proposal by Edmonton City Council. And that's part of what's difficult with misinformation at the local level and at all levels. It often comes alongside good faith criticism or fears from people who are concerned about a certain policy. The narratives were significantly driven and amplified in the case of Edmonton by influencers from outside of Alberta and Canada, including Canadian Jordan Peterson and the UK-based Wide Awake Media. Despite online and in-person resistance, Edmonton did eventually pass its new district plan in 2024, albeit with some superfluous language stating that it would not violate charter-protected rights to freedom, association, and commerce. During the saga, Edmonton faced pretty serious impacts from the mis and disinformation toward its 15-minute city policy. The city had to have expensive, long engagements in city councils, and city planners were confronted in person sometimes. But of course, not every local government will have the same experience as Edmonton did. The impacts of misinformation vary, whether they be on policies, programs, and resources, or on communities or local government officials themselves. Often, with respect to the former, misinformation serves to undermine policy and program implementation, to strain resources, and to promote mistrust of government, which has further impacts on the strength of and trust in democratic institutions. Moreover, misinformation can pose a threat to staff and community health and safety. It can negatively contribute to misgivings about climate science and policies, and it can undermine preparedness for extreme weather events. Some of the misinformation and narratives that most commonly impact local governments include urban planning initiatives, such as rezoning and low-emission zones, mobility and transportation policies, like bike lanes and bus lanes, building policies, including energy use programs, and climate adaptation policies like extreme weather preparedness. Our report includes many examples we found of these types of local government climate policies being the target of misinformation.
And as for tactics used in misleading narratives, opposition to local climate action often follows global or national narratives, but incorporates social and political tensions. We found 7 common narratives, beginning with exaggerating costs and framing climate solutions as financially burdensome in the short term over the long-term impacts of doing nothing. Misrepresenting climate impacts, like downplaying the severity of climate crises by attributing them to unrelated factors, is another. Exaggerating freedom and autonomy concerns as creating government overreach is a common narrative. Greenwashing, which misleads the public about the actions taken by a company, government, or other entity to protect the environment. Misrepresenting climate solutions, like making misleading or false statements about the effectiveness of heat pumps or EVs, as we have seen in Vancouver. Defending the status quo, or quote, discourses of delay, which researchers have coined, that undermine personal responsibility and denounce action until other countries or regions do more. And lastly, delegitimizing and harassing climate advocates and researchers and the local governments who pursue climate action. Many actors shape the local information ecosystem, and these are the key actors we have identified. Some industries and interest groups that have motives to sway the public, like fossil fuel associations or corporate-backed campaigns that are disguised as grassroots movements, which is known as astroturfing. Social media platforms and their algorithms can incentivize engagement on narratives of heightened opposition to climate action. AI is also an increasing concern for local governments, heard throughout many of our interviews, blurring the lines between real and fake. Traditional news organizations, alternative media, and online influencers all have biases, and in turn can shape the way the public views climate action policies. With an increase in alternative media and online influencers and trust in traditional media fading, the news media environment is becoming more vast, which can lead to less prudence in fact-checking. Foreign actors can use climate misinformation to destabilize public trust in climate policy and push geopolitical objectives like protecting fossil fuel industries domestically. Governments can also propagate the fragmented messaging, especially when there is a disconnect between the federal, provincial, and local coordination. This can impact local governments' credibility when it comes to action on climate change. As for those who are targeted by local climate misinformation as well as harassment, elected officials are frequent targets. They are targets of greenwashing campaigns by fossil fuel companies and other governments. They are also the target of hostility or even threats online and in person. We saw this in comments made to Vancouver City councillors who had pushed for the ban on gas hookups in new buildings. As for communities, lower income communities face compounded vulnerabilities of environmental risks and socioeconomic inequalities. Affluent communities who are in opposition to renewable energy or transportation projects may delay or derail climate policies due to NIMBYism, or not in my backyard, rhetoric. And misinformation does not impact all communities equally, hence why it is crucial that local governments build broad coalitions towards climate change.
And now we'll start to talk a bit about responding to disinformation. To start with, it's important to remember that to effectively intervene, climate misinformation should be addressed at all stages of the process. The Disinformation in the City Playbook, which was a report by the German Marshall Fund and Melbourne Center for Cities, proposed a really excellent 3-stage framework to guide local governments through disinformation. They offer the before stage that focuses on identifying and countering misinformation before it spreads, the during stage that focuses on curbing misinformation as it emerges, and the after stage that focuses on recovery and analysis. In our report, we built on this model and proposed a fourth stage, the long-term stage that focuses on systemic change to dismantle the structures that allow for and incentivize misinformation more generally. Our recommendations, which I'll introduce next, all fit into these four stages in one way or another. With that, I'll now move on to the recommendations section, which makes up the second half of our report. We chose to break up our recommendations into 5 categories. These themes do not necessarily focus narrowly on addressing misinformation or disinformation, but rather they orient local governments to develop capacities to anticipate emerging narratives, to implement preemptive communication strategies, and to develop long-term trust-building initiatives. Our 5 categories are messaging, community engagement, collaborations, measurement, and safety. The first set of recommendations revolve around messaging, and it focuses on ensuring climate conversations are relevant, accessible to diverse audiences, and facilitated through trusted community members. Examples of suggestions included in our report for the messaging section include pre-bunking, inoculation, and debunking. Additionally, one of the core components of making climate conversations accessible is working to improve your audience's media literacy. In our report, we offer Helsinki as an example of how to teach improved media literacy. In Helsinki, schools include media literacy in their curriculums, helping students become more savvy when it comes to what they read and believe. The second set of recommendations are similar in that they deal with community engagement and focus on practicing transparent dialogue to strengthen democratic participation and local populations' information resilience. One of the examples we have in our report of a local government practicing strong community engagement comes from Montego Bay, Jamaica, where the local government ran, as part of the Cities Forward program, citizens' assemblies to engage directly with the community about climate policies the government was hoping to enact.
And moving to our third set of recommendations, which is collaboration. Local governments cannot address misinformation alone, and building partnerships with community leaders, researchers, and other stakeholders is essential. Collaboration also fosters shared knowledge and resources and enables a more coordinated, collective response to misinformation. These partnerships also help local governments tap into a broader pool of expertise when addressing misinformation and climate action. For example, staff federations, which are coalitions of local government employees, build expertise over time through knowledge sharing, pilot projects, and research. And as seen on the screen here in New Orleans in the States, the AFSCME in New Orleans is a great example of this measure. As for our fourth set of recommendations, it revolves around measurement. So tracking misinformation is critical for understanding how it spreads and identifying its sources. By measuring the impact of misinformation, local governments can respond more effectively and anticipate future misinformation campaigns. And without this data, it's quite difficult to address the issue effectively. For example, Toronto Metropolitan University's Deepfakes Tracker research portal provides learning tools for responding to misleading information in a rapid response system. And lastly, the impact of information can extend beyond public discourse and target individuals, including local leaders and staff, with harassment and threats. Local governments must ensure the safety and well-being of those involved in climate action, providing the necessary supports for those on the front lines. Creating a supportive atmosphere is crucial to maintaining a stable environment for climate policy development. And local governments must treat harassment as part of occupational safety, developing protocols, training staff, and offering legal and mental health supports. For example, the nonprofit PEN America's online harassment field manual provides guidance to online users in navigating online abuse. And here at the CSDI, we also continue to do work in this area with our research on incivility and abuse in Canadian politics and on the campaign trail. So as we've found, myths and disinformation are best seen as symptoms of more fundamental problems. Addressing those requires the continual work of building trust and public engagement capacity. And as we have outlined in our report, climate conversations do not consist of the removal of problematic messaging, but the active engagement with diverse perspectives. Although this report is focused on Canada, we also have built on insights from experts, advocates, and governments around the world. Local governments must not only recognize the challenges posed by misinformation, but also actively take steps to address it. And by adopting the 5 key strategies we discussed today, local governments can build resilience and empower their communities to engage in more informed, productive conversations about climate action. As misinformation continues to evolve in this chaotic information environment, it's essential for local governments to stay proactive and responsive. And with the right strategies in place, local governments can play a pivotal role in combating misinformation and ensuring the success of climate action initiatives in their backyards. And we appreciate your attention today, and we're very excited for questions and feedback, as well as some key insights from our guest speakers, Roz and Amber.
Thank you so much, Maddie and Ghassan, for that succinct summary of our report. Of course, for the details, everyone will have to dive into the report itself. We've shared the link already, and we'll share it again. I see some great questions coming into the chat, which we will also hopefully address as many of them as we can over the next 38 minutes. But with that, I'd actually like to invite our 2 fantastic guests, Amber Bennett and Ros Donald, onto the virtual stage to start providing us with some broader perspectives on the report, and I think bringing in already some of the larger questions that are being asked in the Q&A as well. So we've got a couple of questions to kick us off, and then, as I say, I'll start weaving in the questions from you, the audience, to Amber, Ros, and to Maddie and Ghassan as well. So please do put those questions in the Q&A for me to take a look. So Amber and Rosalind, given these growing challenges of mis and disinformation in the current media landscape, perhaps especially around climate change, what do you think local governments can do to address these kinds of narratives? And I'll turn to Amber first and then Ros.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me here, and thank you for doing this work. I bring a particularly communications-focused lens to my responses. So I just want to acknowledge that in some cases, what's needed is policy, regulation, much broader than that. But my toolkit really centers around the communications functions. So that's what I'll talk about. And I think that the report did a good job of unpacking kind of some of the dynamics. I think for communicators, it's really important to note that these the kind of underlying conditions that make misinformation and disinformation so powerful have been decades in the making, right? So this kind of fragmented information ecosystem that we have, declining trust in media and government, et cetera, rising fatalism, people don't really know what to do or know what choices to make, et cetera. And so with all of that, I just suppose what I'm saying is it's complicated, and I really feel for the people who are on the front lines who are trying to do this work. I would like to focus on kind of one particular piece, which is to say that we know that Canadians, by and large, still have really weak understanding or weak mental models of what is causing climate change, what are the solutions to climate change, and they have kind of like low information around this. And so I think the report did a great job of talking about pre-bunking and debunking, et cetera. What I would say is the form that information in how we're delivering information to Canadians is really important. And so we're kind of driven as sense-making beings. We want to find patterns, and when we don't have those patterns and we don't see that, we'll kind of make it up. And so stories in particular are extremely powerful sense-making way. It's a powerful way to deliver information. So I think my advice is to resist the temptation to fight misinformation with facts, but rather think about what are the stories and what are the powerful frames that you can give people to help them make sense of the information that they're giving you? So for example, in it right now, we're thinking about like a progress frame. This technology is reliable, it works, this improves health, it improves safety. We need to prepare for climate impacts. Those are kind of frames that allow people to then make sense of the information you're giving them. And then the power of storytelling is it allows you to make sense of a whole bunch of stuff in a really kind of sense-making way. And you can tie it to your community, the benefits that they're seeing, and real people who are like the people that you're talking to. So that would be the thing that kind of pops up for me, is that narratives are kind of created through many different stories, many different headlines, and to resist the temptation of just providing people with a whole bunch of information in the form of facts, but rather what we need are powerful frames that help them then make sense of it. And then we need a whole bunch of really good stories that allow them to see, oh yeah, people like me are concerned about this. People like me are benefiting from this. This is relevant to me and it makes sense to me. So those are the things that came to mind.
Yeah, thank you, Amber. Over to you, Ros.
Well, Amber, that was, sorry, just a second. Sorry about that. I'm having a little trouble with speakers because I'm here with my class, which is really wonderful. So I wanted to just echo what Amber said. I think that one of the things that governments need to think about is how they can tell much broader climate stories that allow people to see themselves in the problems and the solutions. So there's a report out by the Royal Society in the UK that came out in about 2017, and it makes the fantastic point that climate change is not currently a social fact. People don't see themselves as part of the problem or part of the solution necessarily. I think that, we forget that governments can actually be drivers of really important narratives. So local press will report what local governments do. And so, governments can actually help people to see themselves in these problems. So for example, I'm working on media analysis with my students right now. And we see coverage of climate change that doesn't necessarily connect with people's concerns. So people are really worried about rising asthma rates. They're worried about microplastics in the Potomac in DC. They're worried about mold in their houses. But these particular concerns aren't always reflected in the way that government talks about climate change or in the way that the media talk about climate change. These are two really big parts of people's mental maps of what climate change is and what we should do about it. Using this data, something that I would really love governments to do is help people to connect those things and to create a more capacious understanding of what environment is and what climate change is that really includes human concerns as well. People are believing disinformation at greater rates because they believe something is wrong. We've been through a financial crisis where nobody was held accountable. People feel like there is something wrong in the world. And so they're looking for information. And, climate change is, interwoven with so many of these problems. And we have to be able to speak to their concerns in order for them to trust the solutions and to feel included in the way that governments are responding to climate change.
Thank you. Well, there's already so many questions coming up based on what you've said. So I'm going to start picking up on them because they're very perspicacious, I think. So Olivia asks and says, I conduct climate literacy outreach in the city. Do you think, and I think it's more towards you, Amber, do you think an affordability frame is helpful to engage with those who tend to be skeptical of climate action?
Such a great question. and I'm going to answer it, but I'm going to say one thing first before it escapes my mind. So just to build on Rosalind's point, we also have done a national media analysis here, and less than, I think 15% of articles that are talking about climate change or that are talking about climate solutions actually link them to climate change itself. We don't typically talk about the cause of climate change as, that it's caused by burning fossil fuels, which is driving extreme weather. So that kind of basic point of inserting the cause of climate change, which is burning fossil fuels, is really important, because that's why we're talking to people about renewables. That's why we're talking to you about electrification. That's why we're talking to you about energy efficiency, is because we need to burn less fossil fuels. So just to say that kind of key part of the literacy piece. Now, in terms of affordability, interesting enough, we are releasing a report tomorrow on how to communicate about affordability and climate. So if you have not, maybe I'll find the link to that and pop it in the chat. But it's also more complicated, and essentially how people, it's not as simple as just talking to people about dollars and cents. It actually has a lot to do with how people are evaluating the conversation from the beginning. Do they think it's fair? Do they think that the process to get there was fair? Do they think it will benefit them? Will it benefit the people who they're concerned about? Is this a program that is only going to be for elites and, et cetera, et cetera? So I think there's a lot of baggage and a lot of complexity around the conversation related to the affordability of climate solutions and to what degree they save people money, or there's quite a bit that's underneath of that. I think for skeptics, there's a lot of wisdom in talking to them about their own personal experiences first. Mirroring that back, affirming, that yes, weather is weirder. Yes, you're seeing more wildfires. So I would recommend that you listen to what it is that they're concerned about, that you mirror that back, and then you find ways to draw connections into potentially health, topics that address health, topics that address safety, topics that address preparation. Those all tend to be kind of common ground in which there's less polarization than some of the other types of topics. So I hope that's helpful. So I guess it's like go through the impact window or door, talk to them about the things that they that are less polarized, but maybe also important to say, don't leave climate change off the table. It's still important. We still need to be drawing the connections to the cause and to the impacts, but we don't necessarily need to start the conversation there, because partly this is about building relationship and trust to begin with.
Yeah, thank you, Amber. And I think that gets somewhat to Evan's question, which was about addressing NIMBY sentiments. I think you've given some really concrete advice on that as well. I'm now going to fold a few questions together. So Stephanie was asking to talk more about what information resilient communities look like. And I'm just going to tie that in with a question I'll ask Ros first, then Amber, which is that our report also emphasizes the need for culturally relevant and accessible climate communication, especially for marginalized communities. So thinking about this positive vision, whether we call it information resilient communities or something else, how can local governments really make sure that their climate messages resonate with diverse groups and build trust in local climate policies? Ros, you started speaking to that, but I wanted to give you the opportunity to talk a little bit more about that positive vision before we then go to Amber.
Well, I think I'd probably start with listening to communities first and seeing what they're worried about. And they may not be things that seem directly relevant, but the important work is to understand why people are where they are. Because something that I have noticed in sort of field work in Miami and DC is that people who are experiencing sort of the harshest effects of climate change may be talking about climate change in a different way. So, for example, in Miami, historic Black communities are often associating climate change with gentrification. And can be seen as sort of tangential or as irrelevant, unless you understand more where people are coming from. And in my work, something that I suggest is that we have to think about climate change as a historical phenomenon as well as a physical one. Climate change is the result of exploitation of people and nature. And so when people are talking about climate change in ways that seem alien, then it's important to be really cognizant of where they're coming from. If they've experienced displacement in the past, then perhaps that's what they're most concerned about. And they're talking about climate change and gentrification going hand in hand because they're concerned that climate policies are going to displace them, or they're concerned about developers looking at higher ground that has been that has been cheaper because it hasn't been invested in. There's less home ownership because of segregation and disenfranchisement. And so I think that there are engagement has to start with really listening to people, but then also I think governments have to be prepared to actually address some of these concerns, that you can't just do climate policy. Climate policy is interwoven with absolutely everything. And so governments have to be willing to step back and take a look at those things, because otherwise climate policies can backfire, or they can have unintended consequences because of the ways that policies just generally work. Policies often just generally work by disenfranchising people. And so if you really want to engage with the people who are experiencing the least benefits in society, you have to be willing to meet them where they are, but also engage with what they're saying and do something about it.
Yeah, Amber, if there's anything that you want to add on this question.
No, I mean, yes, I just want to echo, I think, what Roz has said, listening and really understanding where your audience is at to begin with. And maybe practically speaking, in the work that we do with local governments, I would say go and talk internally to your community services department, go and talk to social services, go and talk to those other departments who don't necessarily see climate as their file, but who are 100% in relationship with those communities already, have really good relationships and understand their community. Read their engagement reports and then go and see where the gaps are. So just I think a word of caution there. The other thing that came to mind is I think we tend to over rely on narrative messaging, and we forget that there's a whole visual language of climate change as well. And so I think in terms of what's the messaging that your visuals are also, and how can you make visual communications work hard for you? And are they inclusive? Are they representing the communities that you're wanting to engage with? And then finally, I would say also, like, just make it easier. Make it easier for people to get your messaging. Like, I'm probably one of the most motivated people, when it comes to this, but even I give up eventually in trying to track down, and weed through super heavy, text-heavy, dense documents. So make it easier and make it visual. And then lean on those colleagues who are already in relationship with those communities to better understand what their concerns are, what projects are already underway, and do some of that homework first.
Thank you so much. We are going to start zip-zapping through the many open questions that we have, and some of the questions also relate to the report. So I'll bring in Ghassan and Maddie as well as we move through the conversation. So Dan is asking about the collaboration aspect of our solutions. We mentioned individuals and organization in the form of a staff federation, but public libraries also seem to be a perfect fit for locally situated climate communication. So Dan's just asking if we found any examples of local governments liaising with public libraries in this area. So Maddie, let me hand over to you to talk about that.
Yeah. One element of our report research, we found a model in Helsinki, Finland, where media literacy is integrated into schools and the school's curriculum. And they also collaborate with educators and local public libraries because if you think about it, libraries are already spaces of engagement, of gathering, of community, of people using it to access computers when they may not have access. So this is a great way to link community members who may not have met each other already, but maybe live around the corner and provide workshops and training on recognizing disinformation. And I think Rosalind, also, you know of another example. I think we did speak about this briefly. But yeah, if you want to touch on this as well in public spaces as a jumping off point to tackle misinformation.
This is a grant application that I put in that didn't get funded. Such is life. But it was actually part of, so the work that I've been doing with my students too is on an initiative I call the Climate Story Gaps Initiative, which is the idea that how do you bridge the gaps between kind of elite perspectives and people's lived experience? And libraries are such a great opportunity to do that. If anybody wants to fund it, then please let me know. But my idea was to use librarians as like go-betweens, essentially, to help people to connect to policies and services that are in their community, but they may not recognize themselves in the profile of the people who could take advantage of them, or they may not know about them. And so, for example, DC is wanting to electrify public housing, to have heat pumps in place, and people may not think about that in terms of climate change, but if they're coming to the library interested in more information about asthma and services that you can access that way, then a librarian who is trained to connect people to different types of service could be a really amazing sort of community interlocutor, because librarians already help people to get email addresses so that they can claim money from FEMA. They are already there sort of providing climate services. It's just that we don't necessarily think about them in that way. They help people to find cooling centers, and so, the list goes on, but librarians are very much trusted community figures. And I believe that this is one way that, librarians could really capitalize on what they do already to help people to connect to services, and also, really increase that trust and increase those good experiences around climate policies.
Thank you. I'm going to fold together a couple of questions and answer them very briefly myself. So there was a question from Megan, which was about our definition of mis and disinformation. And Letitia was asking, what if the misinformation comes from city staff or councillors themselves? So without spending too long on this topic that we as researchers have spent a long time on, very briefly, misinformation generally refers to something that's mistakenly or unknowingly untrue in some fashion. Disinformation, something deliberate. Now, the difficulty with that is that it's often very difficult to discern whether something is being deliberately spread, whether somebody knows that it's false. This is just to give you one example of the sort of debates that are happening within the research community. And some have also argued that these may not be particularly helpful terms, because so much of what's going on is not necessarily mis or disinformation. It's also other problems. For example, information voids. That's really what Amber was talking about, right? The lack of information. That sometimes it is poor coordination between different levels of government. So that Letitia, what you might be talking about is misinformation. Sometimes it's lack of coordination. Sometimes it's confusion. So we've used misinformation in this report to really try to cover that whole range of types of communication, but we also try to focus in the report on really this idea of building capacity around conversations, because this is, I think, maybe a more productive way of trying to think about what's happening, rather than just trying to focus on whether we're trying to identify the truth value of particular statements and then to evaluate why it is that that's happening. Sometimes that's perhaps less productive than figuring out how do we provide high quality information? How do we address diverse communities? The sorts of things that Amber and Ros are talking about. We don't necessarily always need to enter into the mis versus dis debate to get at these much more deeper and important questions of how we build capacity to have conversations around climate. Okay, next question is from Shane, who is asking, Given many of our social media platforms are now censoring or controlling various types of narrative discourse, especially around climate, what are some learnings you came across that could potentially combat this? And I'm going to combine this with the question from Scott and then turn over to Ghassan to answer both of these. So Scott says, I work as a communicator supporting climate action in a large municipality. We've seen vitriolic comments on Facebook especially, but as a government institution, we feel trapped when it comes to engaging with trolls. How can I convince my managers it is worthwhile, necessary, and constructive to engage in problematic conversations? Ghassan, I'll hand over to you first, and then I'll let Amber and Ros jump in as they would like to.
Yeah, so this was one of the things that was probably most frustrating with this research that we've done on this topic. A lot of the problems that come about from social media are not things that local governments have the capacity to address all the time. It can be really big problems that either the platform itself or higher levels of government should be taking over. That said, it doesn't really help to say that. And so in our report, we do talk about a few things that local governments can do when faced with these sorts of like vitriolic comments. So one of the things is that it's important to remember that there are terms of use for these sorts of sites. I know there's problems that come along with potentially censorship and concerns around that when governments are stepping in and doing anything to like report or flag vitriolic comments. But you're also a person when you're engaging on those sites, and if somebody is coming at you or saying something that is really hurtful or targeted to a person in a government, that sort of thing does often violate terms of service of platforms. And so it's definitely a conversation you have to have within your department or within your local government as to how you want to deal with those. But it's important to remember that there are tools that exist on the platforms, however limited they may be, that are designed to deal with hate comments. Also, hate comments don't necessarily always overlap with misinformation, and sometimes it's hard to you can't justify reporting misinformation, for example, because that can be seen as somebody's opinion. So when it comes to like misinformation and engaging with misinformation that's on online platforms, it really depends on who's coming at you a lot of the time, right? If it's people who are within your community and you recognize them, if you're potentially in like a smaller local government organization, then that's something that you might have to discuss some sort of actual response to. That said, if it's pylons from outside of your community, that's something that we've seen a lot of as well. It may not be worthwhile responding in that case. It really depends on the situation. And there are issues with, like I said, with the ability that you have as a local government to combat these sorts of things online.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ghassan. Next question is from Chelsea, who thanks us for doing this work and is wondering if we had an opportunity to chat with local governments about our findings. If so, what feedback do we receive? And if not, what level of local governments might be early adopters of our findings? So Ghassan or Maddie, if either one of you wants to take on that question.
Yeah, we did just release our report fully edited and the layout is all done. And I believe Chris put that in the chat. So we are sending those findings to our interviewees. But yeah, I think as for municipalities and local governments and who can tackle certain issues, Heidi, who was that question from? Just so I can see the question block.
It was from Chelsea.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just having trouble. Oh yeah. Do you think early adopters? I think local governments would be municipalities, those on the front lines, as I spoke earlier. Those who are at the forefront of their communities definitely will be those attempting to implement some of our findings or take them into consideration. Obviously, they can't all be implemented, but yeah, we are in the process of doing that. And Ghassan, if you want to add.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to take, oh, sorry, Ghassan, please. Now I'm just going to take the question from Adam and maybe hand it over to Amber and Ros. So Adam asks, there are many recent examples of municipal decision-making processes that are more participatory, such as citizens' assemblies and other dialogue-based multi-stakeholder engagement. So it's an effort to really allow people to see themselves in public policy and understand the broader context. So maybe you can say a little bit about how democratic innovation might be able to safeguard against polarization and disinformation. So we might think of this, I'll editorialize as how can more inclusive public policy perhaps be helpful in this space? Maybe Amber, if you want to go first, and then I'll see if Ros has any further thoughts.
Well, I will just say what comes to mind. And what I would say is that these processes are not always visible or apparent to the public or to leadership or to the people or to people within the community. So while you may have engaged in a really democratic and robust public engagement process, and you may have been working with a group of people over a 2-year timeline, et cetera, that isn't always apparent because it's not really visible to people. So again, to go back to kind of my storytelling piece, it's really important that we're doing, we often, I think the trap is that you're kind of feel like it's one and done. And we don't live in that kind of world any longer. You have to constantly, and a constant drumbeat, be talking about what it is that you're doing, who you're doing that for, who is involved, and tell that story. I think in order to keep it fresh and relevant and meaningful for people. So I know that that's not exactly answering. I mean, it's like, yes, best practice plus, like use participatory dialogues and citizen councils and all of that kind of thing. I would say in addition to that, make it visible and keep reminding people of the fact that you are involving, you know, these people and what that conversation is around, and that you're doing that. That's what comes to mind for me.
Yeah, thanks, Amber. Ros, anything you'd like to add?
No, I just completely agree. I think, you know, that repetition is just super important, and you know, it's all of those things all together. It's the listening sessions, it's policy forums, it's inviting people to come and share their ideas for you know, what adaptations could look like, and it's repeating it, and it's making sure that you're talking to people, like trusted people in the local community who are just engaged on an ongoing basis. You know, there are local media personalities who can be involved. There are people who are, so I mean, I keep referring to Miami because that's where I did my dissertation fieldwork, but you know, one really great example of someone who was just engaged constantly about climate change was a Haitian radio personality who was just talking about climate change constantly with her listeners, and you know, in ways that were you know, really accessible and you know, and legible and sort of felt very it felt very immediate for the people that she was talking to, and for local governments to be involved with those people too. So not only their own messaging, but to be making sure that you know, trusted people are also repeating that and telling people how things are moving forward.
Yeah, thank you. I'm now going to take the question from Climate Reality Project. So who's asking, I'm interested in the role of public engagement, which was mentioned as one of the report's strategies. So how can governments distinguish between legitimate concerns that might be raised versus concerns driven by misinformation? How much is it the role of public engagement to move participants towards supporting climate policies versus meeting them where they're at? And I'll hand over to Ghassan first, maybe to answer this one, and then see if Amber and Ros have anything further to add.
I think to answer the first question, a lot of the way to distinguish between narratives that people have heard through misinformation versus legitimate concern is doing your research beforehand as to like what are the common narratives that may occur, or common misinformation narratives that may occur surrounding a given policy that you're trying to introduce. A lot of the times, the narratives that people come with that are misinformation related, they're repeating narratives that they've seen online or that they've seen from influencers that have said stuff about this sorts of policies. So that's a really good way, just doing some research preliminarily. And frankly, if you're working in a local government and you have your ear to the ground in any sense, you're probably going to have a little bit of an understanding of what misinformation narratives are coming out about your policies. That said, another way of telling is on an individual basis. Like if you're speaking with somebody, if they seem to be in the mood to like learn about the policy, like, or truly learn about the policy, then it's possible that they're just misinformed, and they have, there's a potential there to talk them down from that position. But it really depends case by case, right? Some people will come in knowing exactly what misinformation point they believe, and they'll never be I guess, reachable, I would say. And in those cases, it's going to be difficult, right? You're going to be dealing with somebody who might be really vocal, who might have some sort of misinformation that they heard, and it's hard to talk them down out of that position, and it may not even be possible. I think a lot of the time, though, it depends on who's speaking with you. Hopefully, you know the person, or potentially you know the person, or you know the narrative that they're coming at you with, whether that be like misinformation or a genuine concern.
Yeah, and I'll add just before I see if Amber and Ros want to jump in, is that that's part of why we also have recommendations about measurement and about potentially partnering with universities or civil society organizations, because that's going to help you also be able to identify, is this following a pattern we've seen, for example, in another city around this policy that might indicate that this is something that's being driven by other concerns potentially. Amber or Ros, is there anything else that you want to add on this question of genuine concern versus potentially driven by misinformation?
Well, I think just adding on to maybe what Ghassan was saying, there's also an aspect of timing and inoculation. So I think that for municipalities that are considering a policy, a regulation, a new program, et cetera, there are almost certainly other cities, not maybe in Canada, or at least in North America, that have done this before. I would talk to them, and it's not if opposition. You will get it. You will almost certainly get opposition. It's going to be well organized. So getting a handle on what was the experience of those municipalities that have done this before, what did they see, who was active, I think that's just kind of par for the course and something that you need to do. You also need to get well ahead of this. Like this isn't the week before we're hosting an open house. This is like 6 months in advance. We need to, have these particular community members prepped and ready to go. And then finally, I think that the power of particularly well-organized opposition is its ability to harass or destabilize or make elected officials or senior administration particularly fearful or risk averse. So I think it's helpful to brief them to say, not only this is the kind of information you're going to get, but these are the kind of tactics they're going to use. This is how it's going to appear. These are the kinds of strategies that they're going to use, and to include that in your briefings on the topic, so that they understand when they encounter something, what it is, where it's coming from, and to expect it and be prepared.
Yeah, thank you. That's I think really important. That's part of why we have this preparation for support and safety as a really crucial one of our 5 categories, because without that, we're really missing a lot of what happens in this space. Ros, are there any final thoughts that you have before we wrap up imminently in relation to this question?
It seemed like there was sort of a different scales. There was like individual scale and then like the scale of planning, interventions. And I was just thinking at the individual scale, if somebody's come up to you and is repeating some disinformation, something that can be really valuable is to ask somebody, what attracted them to it? Why did they feel like that was important? And it can help you then to understand, why people are attracted to this particular kind of information and what it is that they're really concerned about. And then you can speak to their real concerns.
Thank you. Well, this has been such a rich conversation. We could keep going. We have 11 open questions. I apologize that we couldn't get to all of them. I think it speaks to the importance of this topic, to the wonderful insights, Amber and Ros, that you have shared with us. Thank you for spending the time, for providing your really crucial perspectives. We look forward to your report. Amber, please do pop a link in the chat for where people can find that. We want to thank the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at UBC that helped to co-organize this event today, along with the whole CSDI team, particularly my fantastic co-authors on this report, Divya Madani, Ghassan Hamzeh, Maddie Sides, Nicola Cote and Chris Tenove. We invite you to read the report. It's already up on our website. It goes into all sorts of details that answer actually a lot of the questions you still have open. But please, if you have further questions as you read it, we encourage you to engage with us as you continue to work on and think about this issue. Thank you all so much for being with us, and have a wonderful afternoon and evening.
Thank you very much.